Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm so happy you guys have decided to join us, and we are just going to jump right into the meat of domestic violence as it relates to trauma. Tell me, what would you say are the dangers of a domestic violence victim staying in an abusive relationship?
Well, obviously we're concerned about the continued assault if someone does stay in the relationship, and that is not only traumatic to the victim, but anyone else that's in the household that's witnessing that. For example, children. Children tend to either become victims themselves as they get older or become abusers themselves if they have this long-term access to witnessing these crimes. But the one we're really concerned about is if someone stays in a very volatile situation, there's always the potential of death or homicide.
Wow. Yeah, and you know, we've spoke before, and the one statistic that I just cannot get out of my mind, which you know you both discussed with me, is the fact that, what did you say, about 40 to 50% of the homicides in Fairfax County are due to domestic violence?
Yes, historically it's been around 40 to 50%.
Wow, wow, that's a lot. Okay, well, obviously your services are much needed. And so let's now just explain some of your services. What type of services do you offer domestic violence victims?
So as domestic violence detectives, basically our job is to kind of be the link between patrol and victims. So we not only, our main goal is to facilitate prosecution of these cases, so to successfully prosecute these cases, but then also I think one of the most important things we do is we stay in touch with the victim, whereas like a midnight patrol officer can't really be calling the victim or you know, keeping in touch with them about how the situation is changing and what's going on. We are there for them to reach out to, along with our victim services representatives, to kind of guide them through the process of the court process and everything after the arrest.
Okay, so you're going through all the fine details of the case. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so tell me, what does the police department consider or define as domestic violence?
We consider all kinds of domestic violence, of physical, sexual, financial, emotional, and all of it is considered domestic violence. However, our portion of what we deal with is strictly the physical, because that's what we have the ability to enforce, and that's through the laws. So that's what we focus on, but we're well aware of the fact that there's many facets that make up domestic violence. So we definitely, when we're talking to a victim, we want to know about all of the other pieces of it so we can help get an understanding of maybe other referrals that we need to give to her or him. But the main part that we focus on is the criminal prosecution of the physical violence.
Sure, and I'm guessing that all those other elements are useful in the case as well.
Definitely.
Okay. And so at what point should a victim call the police? Do they wait until something drastic has happened, they were punched or something like that? Or what happens if they're just scared and are anticipating something to happen?
So, I mean, we would encourage people to call the police at any time. I mean, we are always here and we're always willing to come no matter what the situation. But, you know, if a victim is just scared and it hasn't escalated to violence yet, but they fear that it may escalate to violence, we're more than happy to come and help to diffuse the situation, mediate between the two parties, and, you know, make sure that no violence occurs. But obviously, you know, if someone is frightened for their life, they feel that they're in immediate danger, please call 911 immediately so we can get there as soon as possible.
We also understand that not everybody is ready to call the police. It's scary, they don't know what to anticipate, and we understand that. Like Detective O'Malley said, if your life is in danger, you definitely need to be calling 911 to get us there. But if it hasn't risen to that level yet, and you're still not too sure if you want to go the route of contacting the police because you don't feel comfortable, there are several other resources. We've told people before that they can call us and remain anonymous and just run their situation by us so they can get some guidance as to what to do. Our victim services specialists are civilians that work with the police department, so they're not cops, and a lot of times people feel more comfortable speaking with them, so that's an option as well. We have a domestic violence action center in Fairfax County where they can call, counseling services, domestic violence hotlines, so you don't have to call the police for everything, especially if you don't feel comfortable doing so.
Okay. Well, being a survivor myself, I would say to victims to pretty much they should think of themselves first. I think a lot of the times they spend too much time thinking of their abusers. But for the sake of the show, for some, people who may be in situations involving domestic violence, can you tell them what to expect if they actually do call the police?
So I think kind of the first thing that, when you call the police, the first person that you're going to encounter is a dispatcher. They're going to pick up the phone, and it's really important to understand the questions that they're going to ask you so you're prepared with the answers and are able to get all the important information out as quickly as possible. And if you're in a situation where you maybe can't talk long, or you need to call 911, and the most important thing to get out is your address. First thing you need to get out is your address, because without your address, we can't get there. We don't know where we're going. We can't get there to help you. So the first and most important thing is your address. But then from there, they're going to ask you your name, your phone number, so they can call you back if it gets disconnected. And they're going to ask you questions about safety, because that's always our primary concern. Were weapons used? Where are the weapons? And then another important thing to think about is for your offender, be able to describe him, provide his information, his name, his date of birth, as well as if he's known to leave the scene, what kind of vehicle does he drive, what's the tag number of that vehicle. So all that's very important, and that's kind of the first step to getting the police there. But then next, when police officers come to your house, what they're going to do is they're going to, one, make sure everyone's safe. But from there, they're going to separate both parties, hear both sides of the story, find out exactly what happened. And our job at that point is to determine first if a crime occurred, and then do we have probable cause for an arrest. And in domestic violence cases, we're looking for what's called determining the predominant aggressor in the situation. So once officers have kind of determined all that, they'll make a decision about an arrest and take someone into custody at that point. But they're also going to take the time to take photographs of the scene, collect any evidence that might be on the scene, as well as talk to the victim about the resources that are available for them. So one of the things that officers typically have to return to the scene if an arrest is made, the magistrate in most cases will issue what's called an emergency protective order. So they're going to talk to the victim about all that, as well as other resources like shelters that are available here in Fairfax County, the domestic violence detectives, as well as provide them with the victim services resource as well.
Okay. And so a lot of times when people think about domestic violence, they automatically think of women being victims. Have you had any experiences where men were actually victims of domestic violence?
We do. It's happening. It happens pretty frequently. I'd say between 15 to 20% of our victims are male, and they get the same services offered to them as the females, and the same rights are afforded to them as the females, and the investigation on our part is exactly the same.
Okay, great. And so can you guys share a traumatic case that you remember that may have shocked you concerning domestic violence?
Sure. We've actually talked about this before, and I think trauma can be divided into two different categories, the physical and the emotional trauma. The one case that I can think of is more physical, and that was a victim who'd been suffering abuse for a long time, and by the time she finally got the courage to call the police, she was transported to the hospital where I responded. And even the nurses at the hospital said that they had never seen anything like it before. We couldn't tell where her old bruising ended and where her new bruising began, because she was literally bruised from head to toe. She was down to 76 pounds at the hospital. She had a large gash above her eye that her abuser offered to stitch up himself with needle and thread. So that was pretty traumatic injury, and actually 5 years later after this incident, she still has permanent bruising from her abuse. So that was an example of the physical trauma that a victim can undergo.
Wow. Whereas I've, dealt with a victim who, although, there was some physical trauma, the majority of what I think was very traumatic for her was the emotional aspect. And, first of all, when she was in the relationship, the manipulation that she went through, the degradation that she endured from her abuser, but then, making the struggle with making that decision to leave, and then living with that decision to have left, and sort of constantly wondering if she'd made the right decision. It continues to be a struggle for her.
Well, thank you, Detective Wallace and Detective O'Malley, for joining us today on Community Chat. And coming up next, we have more in store for you concerning domestic violence and trauma.
My son has been drinking, and I think he's using drugs.
I just feel so ugly. I don't want anybody to see me.
I'm so sad all the time. I can barely get out of bed.
I just needed to talk to someone because I miss him so much.
Stand strong. No matter what you're going through, there is hope at the end of the line.
Focus on the family. How can we help?
Do you know of a good internet filter I can use to protect my kids when they're online?
I'm calling because my son's music is it's disturbing. It's dark and angry, and I'm just concerned.
Could you pray with me? My sister, she has to get her appendix taken out, and I'm really worried.
So what do you think? When should I start talking to my kids about sex?
Stand strong. No matter what you're going through, there is hope at the end of the line.
Focus on the family. How can we help?
Welcome back to Community Chat. I'm Tanikia Polk, your host. We're discussing the trauma of domestic violence today. And sometimes getting out of a domestic violence situation can seem just as traumatic as staying in one. Victims can experience homelessness, court battles, unemployment, and major health issues when they flee. Well, our next guest helps the victims maneuver through these difficulties by helping them stay informed and safe. And so joining us today is a victim specialist from the Fairfax County Police Department Victim Services, Saray Heath. Welcome, Saray.
Hi, thank you.
So, Saray, this is kind of a reunion for us.
Yes.
Because you so kindly helped me in my situation to help get some much needed resources. So let's share that with some of our viewers. I'm sure they'll find it pretty informative.
Okay.
So tell us about the Victim Services.
So the Victim Services section is a civilian unit within the police department. We're not police officers, but we are civilians. And we follow up with victims of all crimes, including domestic violence victims, to provide them with information, resources, referrals, access to things that they may need immediately. And then we add a direct service component to that kind of guides them through the criminal justice system, providing them with court accompaniment, preparation, and a realistic explanation of what to expect during that process. Yeah. The whole goal is to try and prevent secondary trauma that might be incurred through kind of entering into that courthouse and that whole criminal justice process.
Yeah, secondary trauma, and that's a phrase that you introduced me to. Yeah. And it all makes sense now because I was just so surprised that you actually cared to help in this situation. So, and I think that's what what your department does is provide those helpful services and hope for victims to walk them through it. So what would you say is the greatest need amongst victims?
I think that for all victims, information in the beginning, immediate information. Oftentimes, especially with domestic violence victims, there has been this critical incident. The police have responded, and for many of them, life is instantly changed at that moment. And they encounter numerous needs. Housing. Where am I going to stay for the night? I can't go home. My abuser hasn't been arrested yet. I don't know where they are, and my children and I can't stay in the house. So housing is often one of those needs. We make numerous referrals often to the Artemis House shelter in Fairfax County for that. The other is information. What's going to happen next? And making sure that those victims have the information that they need that keeps them safe, and the information that we can provide to help them do that. And then access to things that are going to help them, access to additional resources, community-based agencies, and then what's going to come next.
Okay, great. And a lot of victims don't realize that once they've stepped out of the domestic violence situation, they've kind of walked into this other legal realm. Can you discuss some of the services you provide in the court system?
Sure. So usually our response is very reactive in the police department. So an officer there's been a call for service, and police have responded to a scene, and then they've assessed it, and then they've closed that case out with an arrest. And so we're following up with the victim afterwards to kind of assess those needs that we were just talking about earlier with safety and everything. But then we're also introducing them to their rights as a crime victim and what their rights are throughout the criminal justice process. How do you get that protective order that you might need extended? How do you set all of that in motion immediately after a huge crisis has happened? And then how do you prepare them for encountering their abuser again in the courtroom? And what can we do to kind of reduce that further trauma that might happen with that? And so what we are doing is giving them information about what's actually going to happen when they walk into the courthouse. Who are they going to talk to? What kinds of things are they going to see while they're in there? And then making sure that we're there to answer any questions they might have along through that process.
Okay. And so what would you say, those are the needs. What service is most utilized in your department?
I would say that our direct service that we're providing is our court advocacy piece, and companioning that victim through the process, whether it's the misdemeanor process or a long-running felony court process. I believe that is probably our service that is in most demand. But with those victims also comes resources and referrals, because just because the court process ends doesn't mean the process of rebuilding their life and adjusting to the new normal that they have doesn't end. So they need access to ongoing support services.
All right, which leads me to another question. How long do you work with victims?
So for most cases, it can be 3 to 4 months before a misdemeanor case resolves. Felony cases, it can be longer. It can be 6 months, a year, year and a half. There are some cases that we have repeat victimizations. So you may find those cases that we carry for maybe 3 to 4 years, where we have one victim who leaves, has the protective order, and then there are multiple violations over time that keep happening, and so they keep re-entering that whole court system. And so usually within our unit we try to stay with those cases that we may have started with, so that we can continue to work with that victim.
Okay. All right, and so again, you've been doing this a pretty long time. Yeah. What do you find most inspiring about your job?
I think the most inspiring piece is, unfortunately, we meet people at the worst possible times of their life, most commonly. And for me, and I know for others in our unit, we really value that. And we kind of hold that in a position of high regard within ourselves, and that we want to be a helpful person in that situation and not a harmful person in that situation. Mm-hmm. And so we believe that the information that we have can really have a positive impact during that time. So that's probably the most inspiring part of it.
Okay, and the challenges?
I think that the challenge is the same as the inspiring part, because it's challenging to make sure that you're giving them that correct information and giving them the information that they need. So I think that those two questions have the exact same answer for us.
Okay. Okay. And I know there's always a need for additional resources financially,
yes.
But there is some help out there. Can you explain the criminal, what is it called, criminal injuries?
Criminal Injuries Compensation Fund,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And so they're actually going through a new process of kind of changing it to the Virginia Victims Fund.
Okay.
So under the Virginia statute, if you are a crime victim, you may be eligible for certain financial relief through the Criminal Injuries Compensation Fund. And that may include assistance with moving expenses, assistance with medical bills if you had medical bills and you've incurred costs from that. So they may be able to assist with those things, counseling, replacement of certain things that you may need. So there's a variety of things that they can assist with, and we can facilitate that process.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Saray, for coming by. And up next, we are going to move from domestic violence victims to overcomers, at least take a step with forgiveness. We have an author spotlight coming up, as well as some more educational information on forgiveness. Stay tuned.
Say to me, well, how did you do that? Could you forgive someone? I was never alone. Right. I didn't do any of this alone. Mm-hmm. So that makes it a lot easier.
She gave such a thrilling story of what really took place in her life, and I think everyone should get an opportunity to read this book. Just from start to finish, you don't know what people go through a lot of times, and even though they look good on the outside, you don't know what they've gone through, and so you don't know what's happening on the inside.
Welcome back. I like to categorize the 3 life stages of someone affected by domestic violence as 1, a victim, 2, a survivor, and 3, an overcomer. I want to talk with you briefly about the overcoming phase, where I am in my life right now. Here's when you learn how to stop letting your past dictate your future. And a big part of overcoming is actually forgiveness. So, what is forgiveness? Well, forgiveness is like a contract. Let's just say this is a contract. And what forgiveness does is it breaks a bad bond between 2 people. Just like this. Forgiveness says, you don't owe me anything. Say this was a debt. Forgiveness is when the person rips up the debt and says, you don't owe me anything. Okay? Forgiveness says, yes, you abused me, but you don't owe me anything. Forgiveness could say, yes, you stole something from me, but you don't owe me anything. Forgiveness could say, yes, you neglected to protect me, to provide for me, but you don't owe me anything. So the next question becomes, why do we forgive? And personally, I stand on the scripture, Mark 11:25 and 26. But if ye do not forgive, neither will your Father which is in heaven forgive you your trespasses. I offend God, myself, and others intentionally or unintentionally. So I need God's forgiveness in my life. Being able to receive God's forgiveness means receiving His love and peace. So if we don't forgive others, we're blocking God's love and peace in our lives. Next, let's talk about who to forgive. Now, there are 3 categories you need to consider in forgiveness. A lot of times people only consider one. Okay, so when you forgive, you need to also include God, yourself, and others. Be kind to yourself. Next, when to forgive. And the answer to that question, surprisingly to some, is all day, every day. It's a continual process, something that we're always going to be doing continually. We have to work to forgive the past, the present, continually. And lastly, we're going to discuss how to forgive. But before we discuss how to forgive, let's discuss how not to forgive as it relates to victims of domestic violence. Now, when I first learned about the principles of forgiveness, I wanted to go to everyone who defended me and tell them, I forgive you. But let me tell you, that is naive, and it can put you in real danger. Forgiving an abuser does not mean you have to talk to them or spend time with them. Forgiveness takes place in your heart. If it involves someone responsible, yeah, well, maybe you can express your forgiveness to the other person. But if you're forgiving a scorner, you can forgive them, but you don't have to reconcile with them. You don't have to tell them you've forgiven them either. So sometimes when we've been holding a lot of bitterness and unforgiveness against people, so often we may actually need deliverance from a spirit of unforgiveness. I guess one of the biggest principles in learning how to forgive and actually putting it into action is saying it with your mouth. We have to speak it. So sometimes we just need to confess that we forgive a person with our mouths, even if that person isn't around. We can say to ourselves, I forgive XYZ every time a bitter thought comes to mind. It's important that you say it out loud, even if you mumble it to yourself. And then finally, another key step to forgiving is prayer. I found that praying for the person you forgive can also be helpful. I don't mean the simple Lord bless them prayer. I mean sincerely asking God to meet that person's need for about 3 to 5 minutes. I do this often as I'm still overcoming. As victims and survivors of domestic violence, it may seem like an insult for me to suggest you to forgive your abuser. However, all the overcomers I've met have done just that, forgiving their abusers. Not just a spouse, but all the abusers in their lives. If you've been a victim of domestic violence and you're willing to try forgiveness, I welcome you to the Club of Domestic Violence Overcoming. Well, thank you, detectives, for joining us, and thank you, Saray. And our time is up for this show. My name is Tanikia Polk, and thank you for watching Community Chat. I hope you were educated and inspired. If you'd like to learn more about domestic violence, visit domesticviolence.tv. If you'd like to learn more information about our featured author, visit tp-rewards.com. God bless. Hey, this is Tanikia Polk, CEO and publisher of TP Rewards Publishing, and we publish books for education and inspiration. We publish books to create community. Please do give us a call. Our number is 888-882-4093, or visit us online at www.tp-rewards.com.